The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of forward operating base whiskey. Major General Harrison's voice carried across the communications tent, heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "We've got 18 Marines pinned down in the Helmand Valley. Taliban forces have them surrounded on 3 sides, and the terrain—" He paused, staring at the topographical map spread before him like a death sentence. "The terrain makes extraction impossible." Intelligence officer Captain Rodriguez leaned forward, his finger tracing the narrow canyon walls that rose like tombstones around the trapped unit. "Sir, the valley's barely 200 meters wide at the mouth. Any rotary-wing aircraft going in there is flying into a meat grinder. The insurgents have positioned RPGs on the ridgelines. It's a perfect kill box." The general's weathered face remained stoic, but those who'd served with him for years could see the muscle twitching in his jaw. 18 Marines. 18 sons, daughters, fathers, mothers. The math was brutal and simple. Any rescue attempt would likely cost more lives than it saved. The words hung unspoken in the tense, suffocating air. Outside, the first hints of dawn painted the Afghan sky in shades of amber and blood. In 3 hours, the Taliban would have clear sight lines down into the valley floor, where Delta Squad had been conducting a reconnaissance mission that had gone catastrophically wrong. Their encrypted radio calls had grown increasingly desperate over the past 6 hours, ammunition running low, wounded accumulating, hope fading with each passing minute. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, the base's air operations commander, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, we've run every scenario through the computer models. Helicopters are out, too slow, too vulnerable in that terrain. Fast movers can't provide the precision support needed without risking friendly fire in such close quarters." The silence stretched like a taut wire. Somewhere in that valley, Marine Corporal Jackson was probably checking his remaining magazines for the dozenth time. Private First Class Kim might be applying pressure to Sergeant Murphy's leg wound, whispering reassurances she didn't believe herself. These weren't statistics on a casualty report. They were human beings with families waiting back home, with dreams beyond this God-forsaken patch of earth. General Harrison's aide, a young captain whose name tag read Mitchell, cleared his throat tentatively. "Sir, there might be one option we haven't considered." The tent fell silent except for the distant hum of generators and the occasional pop of small arms fire echoing across the base perimeter. "Speak," Harrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of 3 decades in uniform. Mitchell's hand trembled slightly as he pointed to a single aircraft designation on the flight roster. "We have an A-10 Thunderbolt pilot on standby. Call sign Wraith. She's—" He hesitated, knowing the reputation that preceded this particular aviator through the ranks like wildfire. The radio crackled to life with Delta Squad's increasingly frantic transmissions from the valley floor, and time was running out. Captain Alina Wraith Vasquez sat alone in the pre-flight briefing room, her olive-drab flight suit bearing the faded patches of a dozen deployments across 3 different theaters of war. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face as she studied satellite imagery of the Helmand Valley, her dark eyes tracing every ridge, every possible approach vector, every deadly angle where enemy fire might find her aircraft. She'd earned her call sign during her first deployment in Iraq, slipping through enemy airspace like a ghost, striking hard and disappearing before surface-to-air missiles could lock onto her position. But that was 5 years and countless missions ago, before the incident in Syria that had nearly ended her career, before the whispers in ready rooms across 3 continents, before she'd been quietly reassigned to this remote Afghan outpost where problem aviators were sent to fade into obscurity. The briefing room door opened with a metallic groan, and General Harrison entered, followed by his staff. Wraith rose to attention, her movement crisp despite the exhaustion that had become her constant companion during these final weeks of her military service. Her separation papers sat on her bunk, already signed, her civilian life beckoning from the other side of an ocean, and a lifetime of service. "At ease, Captain," Harrison said, his voice carrying none of the usual military formality. This wasn't a routine briefing, they both knew it. "I'm going to be straight with you, Vasquez. We have Marines dying in that valley and every conventional option has been exhausted. The terrain is impossible, the enemy positions are ideal, and frankly—" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "Most of my pilots think it's a suicide run." Wraith nodded slowly, understanding the subtext. She was expendable, a pilot whose career was already over, whose reputation had been carefully buried in classified files, whose loss wouldn't create the same ripple effects as losing one of the golden boys who still had futures ahead of them in the service. "What's the tactical situation, sir?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. Colonel Barnes stepped forward, activating the digital display that showed the valley in stark relief. 18 Marines from Delta Squad, surrounded on 3 sides by an estimated 40 to 50 Taliban fighters. The enemy has established firing positions on the ridgelands here, here, and here. He indicated with a laser pointer, creating intersecting fields of fire that make any approach extremely hazardous. The satellite imagery revealed the brutal geometry of the trap. The valley floor was barely wide enough for a football field, surrounded by steep walls that rose nearly 300 meters on either side. Ancient goat paths carved into the rock face provided perfect elevated positions for the enemy, while the Marines huddled in whatever cover they could find among the scattered boulders and sparse vegetation below. "Rules of engagement?" Wraith asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Weapons free," Harrison replied grimly. "Friendly forces are marked with IR strobes, but visual confirmation is mandatory before engaging. We can't afford friendly fire casualties on top of everything else." The A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its gray paint scheme designed to blend with overcast skies and concrete runways. To most observers, the aircraft appeared almost ungainly, a twin-engine attack jet built around a massive 30 GAU-8 Avenger cannon that could fire depleted uranium rounds at a rate of nearly 4,000 rounds per minute. But Wraith saw beauty in its utilitarian design, in the way every component served the singular purpose of bringing overwhelming firepower to ground targets while keeping her alive long enough to return home. She ran her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision of someone who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between mission success and becoming another memorial plaque in a squadron-ready room. Her hands traced familiar paths across control surfaces, checking hydraulic fluid levels, ensuring weapon systems were properly configured for the mission ahead. Ground Crew Chief Master Sergeant Torres approached, his weathered face showing the strain of too many deployments and too little sleep. "She's ready to go, Captain. Full load of 30 Mike, plus Mavericks and Hydra rockets. Fuel tanks are topped off, but given the distance to target and likely time on station." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew she'd be operating at the edge of her aircraft's range, with minimal fuel reserves for extended combat operations. "What's the weather looking like?" Wraith asked, zipping her flight suit and reaching for her helmet. "Scattered clouds at 15,000, winds from the northwest at 12 knots. Visibility is good, but there's a front moving in from the west that could complicate things if you're out there too long," Torres replied, handing her the mission data card that would upload target coordinates and communication frequencies into her aircraft systems. Wraith nodded, clipping the card to her kneeboard alongside approach charts and emergency procedures she hoped she wouldn't need. The weight of the mission settled across her shoulders like a familiar burden, 18 lives hanging in the balance, her own career already in ruins, and one final chance to prove that some things mattered more than personal reputation or institutional politics. She climbed into the cockpit, the familiar embrace of the ejection seat and instrument panels providing a strange comfort. This had been her office for the better part of a decade, her sanctuary above a world that had grown increasingly complex and morally ambiguous. Up here, surrounded by switches and gauges and weapon systems, the mission parameters were clear. Find the enemy, eliminate the threat, protect the friendlies, come home alive. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines spooled up with their characteristic whine, sending vibrations through the airframe as critical systems came online. Radio checks with the tower, weapons systems verification, navigation computer alignment. Each step in the pre-takeoff checklist brought her closer to launching into an uncertain morning sky where the margin for error measured in seconds and inches. Tower, Wraith-01, ready for departure, she transmitted, her voice calm despite the knowledge that she might never speak those words again. They rolled down the runway with deceptive grace, its ungainly appearance on the ground transforming into purposeful efficiency as airspeed built, and the wings began to generate lift. Wraith felt the familiar moment of transition as the aircraft separated from Earth, that instant when physics took over, and she became part of something larger than herself, a fusion of human skill and mechanical precision hurtling toward a rendezvous with violence. At 5,000 feet, she banked southwest toward the Helmand Valley, the Afghan landscape spreading below her like a crumpled map written in shades of brown and gold. The early morning sun cast long shadows across ridgelines and valleys, creating a deceptive beauty that masked the deadly reality of insurgent forces moving through terrain that had swallowed armies for centuries. Wraith-01, this is Overwatch, came the voice of the forward air controller embedded with Delta Squad, his transmission crackling with static and tension. We have you on GPS. Current situation. Friendlies are in a defensive perimeter approximately 2 clicks north of your present position. Enemy forces are positioned on the high ground, estimated company strength with heavy weapons. Wraith checked her tactical display, correlating the controller's position reports with the satellite imagery she'd memorized during the briefing. The valley stretched ahead of her like an open wound in the earth, its narrow confines creating a natural funnel that would channel her aircraft directly into the enemy's field of fire. Standard tactics called for multiple attack runs from different vectors, but the terrain offered no such luxury. There was one way in and one way out, with mountains rising on both sides like the walls of a tomb. Overwatch, Wraith-01 copies. I'm showing multiple heat signatures on the ridgelines. Can you confirm friendly positions with IR strobes? She transmitted, beginning her descent toward the valley mouth while running through weapons selection procedures that had become second nature after thousands of hours of training and combat operations. Roger, Wraith. Friendlies are marking their position now. Be advised, we're taking heavy fire from positions Bravo and Charlie on your tactical display. We've got wounded down here and we're running low on ammunition. The controller's voice carried the controlled desperation of someone who'd seen too much combat, who understood that this might be their last chance for extraction. Wraith could hear small arms fire in the background of his transmission, the distinctive crack of AK-47s mixing with the heavier thump of machine gun fire, and the occasional explosion of rocket-propelled grenades. She brought the A-10 down to 2,000 feet above ground level, low enough to identify targets visually, but high enough to maintain some margin of safety from small arms fire. The valley walls rose on either side like ancient sentinels, their rocky faces scarred by millennia of erosion and decades of warfare. Somewhere below, 18 Marines were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds, their fate now resting in her hands and the deadly accuracy of her aircraft's weapons systems. The tactical situation unfolded before her with crystalline clarity. Enemy positions marked by muzzle flashes and heat signatures. Friendly forces clustered in whatever cover they could find on the valley floor. The narrow margins between success and disaster measured in degrees of bearing and seconds of time. Overwatch, I have eyes on friendly strobes. Confirm you have wounded requiring immediate evacuation. Wraith's voice carried across the radio waves as she banked the A-10 into a shallow left turn, giving her a better view of the tactical situation while maintaining enough airspeed to avoid becoming an easy target for enemy fire. Affirmative, Wraith. We have 3 urgent surgical and 2 priority casualties. Corpsman says we need medevac within the hour or we're going to lose them. The forward air controller's transmission was punctuated by the sound of incoming rounds impacting nearby positions, small explosions of dirt and rock that spoke to the intensity of the enemy fire raining down from the ridgelines. From her vantage point 2,000 feet above the valley floor, Wraith could see the deadly precision with which the Taliban had established their ambush. The enemy fighters had positioned themselves in a horseshoe formation along the high ground, creating intersecting fields of fire that turned the narrow valley into a killing zone. Any helicopter attempting to extract the Marines would be destroyed long before reaching the landing zone, while ground reinforcements would face the same murderous crossfire that had trapped Delta Squad in the first place. The A-10's targeting systems painted a complex picture on her heads-up display, multiple heat signatures scattered across the ridgelines, some stationary, others moving between positions with the tactical awareness of experienced fighters. These weren't untrained insurgents firing wildly into the valley. They were disciplined combatants who understood the geometry of the battlefield and had positioned themselves to maximize their advantage while minimizing their exposure to return fire. Wraith-01, this is Hammer Base, came General Harrison's voice over the command frequency, his words carefully measured despite the urgency of the situation. Be advised, you are authorized to engage targets of opportunity, but maintain positive identification of friendly positions at all times. How copy? Hammer Base, Wraith-01 copies all. Beginning attack run on target area Bravo, she responded, selecting her 30mm cannon and beginning the careful process of lining up her first strafing pass. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon was a precision instrument despite its awesome destructive power, capable of placing depleted uranium rounds within inches of their intended target at ranges exceeding a mile. The A-10 descended into the valley like a predator sensing wounded prey, its twin engines providing the distinctive sound that had earned the aircraft its nickname among ground forces, the Warthog. But there was nothing crude or ungainly about the way Wraith maneuvered the aircraft through the confined airspace, her inputs to the flight controls precise and economical as she aligned the aircraft's nose with her first target area. Through her helmet-mounted sight, she could see muzzle flashes winking along the northern ridgeline like deadly fireflies. Enemy fighters were concentrating their fire on the Marine positions below, unaware that death was approaching from above at 300 miles per hour. The range closed rapidly, 2,000 meters, 1,500, 1,000, until she reached the optimal firing solution. Guns, 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 she transmitted, her finger depressing the trigger that unleashed a torrent of 30 rounds toward the enemy positions. The sound of the GAU-8 Avenger cannon was unlike anything else in the arsenal of modern warfare, a deep, resonant roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air as depleted uranium rounds screamed toward their targets at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. From Wraith's position in the cockpit, she watched tracer rounds arc down toward the ridgeline like falling stars, each burst precisely aimed at the heat signatures her targeting system had identified as enemy combatants. The effect was immediate and devastating. The enemy fire that had been raining down on Delta Squad's position suddenly slackened as Taliban fighters dove for cover or were eliminated by the precision strikes. Dust and debris erupted along the ridgeline where the 30 rounds impacted, sending shock waves through the rocky terrain that had seemed impregnable just moments before. Wraith, Overwatch, beautiful shooting. Enemy fire from the North Ridge has stopped completely. You've given us some breathing room down here, the forward air controller transmitted, his voice carrying the first note of hope she'd heard since beginning the mission. But Wraith knew this was only the beginning. The Taliban fighters were disciplined and experienced. They would adapt quickly to the new threat from above, dispersing to alternate positions and bringing anti-aircraft weapons to bear against her aircraft. She had perhaps minutes before they reorganized and began engaging her with everything from small arms fire to shoulder-launched surface-to-air missiles. Overwatch, Wraith is coming around for a second pass on the western ridgeline. Keep your heads down, she transmitted, banking the A-10 into a climbing right turn that would position her for an attack on the enemy positions that had been providing enfilade fire against the Marines' eastern flank. The aircraft responded to her control inputs with the predictable reliability that had made the A-10 legendary among close air support pilots. Unlike the high-performance fighters that dominated media coverage and popular imagination, the Warthog was built for one purpose: surviving in the deadly environment of low-altitude combat while delivering precise firepower in support of ground forces. Its titanium armor could withstand hits from 23 cannon fire. Its redundant systems could function even with major battle damage, and its weapons systems were optimized for the kind of close-quarters combat that was unfolding in the valley below. As she completed her turn and lined up for the second attack run, Wraith caught sight of movement along the southern ridgeline, enemy fighters repositioning with what appeared to be a shoulder-launched missile system. The threat warning system in her cockpit remained silent, indicating they hadn't yet achieved a firing solution, but she knew that would change rapidly as she committed to the attack run. The tactical situation was evolving by the second. On the valley floor, she could see the infrared strobes marking friendly positions, clustered in a defensive perimeter that was slowly contracting as ammunition ran low and casualties mounted. The Taliban fighters on the western ridge were maintaining a steady rate of fire despite the destruction she'd inflicted on their northern positions, their muzzle flashes providing clear targets for her next attack. Time compressed into the eternal seconds of combat, where split-second decisions carried life-or-death consequences, and there was no room for doubt or hesitation. Wraith-01, be advised we're tracking multiple personnel moving along the southern ridge with what appears to be man-portable air defense systems. Recommend you vary your attack profile, came the warning from an airborne early warning aircraft orbiting at high altitude, its sophisticated sensors providing a god's-eye view of the developing battle. Wraith acknowledged the transmission while simultaneously processing the tactical implications. The Taliban fighters were bringing surface-to-air missiles into play, forcing her to choose between the methodical approach that would maximize accuracy and the evasive maneuvering that would keep her aircraft alive. It was a calculation every close air support pilot faced in combat. How much risk was acceptable to provide effective fire support for troops in contact? She selected a Maverick missile from her weapons inventory, its infrared seeker head providing a fire-and-forget capability that would allow her to engage targets from greater range while minimizing her exposure to enemy fire. The targeting computer overlaid symbology on her heads-up display, showing the optimal firing parameters as she maneuvered the A-10 toward the next attack run. Overwatch, I'm going to put a Maverick into the western ridge position. Danger close for friendlies. What's your distance from target area Charlie? She transmitted, ensuring that her precision-guided munition wouldn't endanger the Marines she was trying to protect. Wraith, we're approximately 200 meters southeast of target area Charlie. We can take the overpressure. Just get those guns off our backs, came the reply, the forward air controller's voice tight with the controlled desperation of someone who understood they were running out of time and options. The missile left the aircraft's wing pylon with a brief flash of rocket exhaust, its guidance system immediately acquiring the heat signature of enemy fighters, positioned among the rocks and sparse vegetation of the western ridgeline. Wraith watched its trajectory on her tactical display, knowing that in approximately 12 seconds, 125 pounds of high explosive would transform that section of mountainside into a crater. But even as the missile flew toward its target, she was already maneuvering for her next attack, aware that the Taliban fighters on the southern ridge were likely preparing to engage her aircraft with whatever air defense systems they'd managed to bring into position. The threat warning system in her cockpit remained ominously quiet. Either they didn't have a lock on her aircraft yet, or their weapons systems were too primitive to trigger her electronic warfare suite. The Maverick impacted exactly where she'd aimed it, sending a column of smoke and debris into the morning sky as the explosion echoed off the valley walls. Secondary explosions suggested the missile had hit an ammunition cache or weapons position, multiplying the destructive effect and eliminating multiple enemy fighters with a single precisely placed munition. Outstanding shooting, Wraith. Western Ridge is quiet now. You've bought us some time to reorganize and treat our wounded, Overwatch transmitted, his voice carrying genuine relief for the first time since the engagement had begun. But Wraith knew the tactical situation was far from resolved. The enemy still held positions on the southern ridge, and more importantly, they were adapting to her presence with the kind of tactical flexibility that marked them as experienced combatants, rather than the poorly trained insurgents that populated intelligence briefings back at headquarters. The threat warning system finally came alive with electronic chirps and visual indicators as enemy fighters achieved a radar lock on her aircraft. Wraith immediately began evasive maneuvers, dropping chaff and flares, while maneuvering the A-10 in a series of unpredictable turns, designed to break the missile guidance system's track on her heat signature and radar cross-section. Wraith-01, missile launch from the southern ridge. Break left, came the urgent warning from the airborne early warning aircraft, its crew watching the developing engagement on radar screens that reduced the life-and-death struggle to glowing symbols and data tracks. She threw the A-10 into a violent left turn while simultaneously deploying countermeasures, the aircraft systems working to confuse the incoming surface-to-air missile, while she maneuvered toward the relative safety of the valley's eastern wall. The missile streaked past her canopy close enough that she could see its exhaust trail, the proximity of death measured in feet rather than the comfortable distances that characterized most aerial combat. Wraith is defensive, taking effective SAM fire from the southern positions, she transmitted, her voice professionally calm despite the adrenaline surge that came with nearly being shot down. The A-10's armored cockpit had protected her from small arms fire on previous missions, but a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile would be catastrophic regardless of the aircraft's legendary survivability. On the valley floor, the Marines of Delta Squad were using the respite she'd provided to consolidate their position and treat their wounded, but she could see through her targeting system that their situation remained desperate. The enemy still commanded the high ground, and while her attacks had disrupted their fire and eliminated some of their positions, enough Taliban fighters remained to make extraction by helicopter impossible. Overwatch, what's your assessment of remaining enemy strength? She asked while maneuvering to avoid potential missile engagement zones, her tactical display showing multiple heat signatures still scattered across the southern ridgeline. Wraith, we estimate 15 to 20 enemy remaining in fighting positions. They've got at least 2 crew-served weapons still active, and what appears to be a recoilless rifle position on the high ground to our south. We need those positions eliminated before any extraction attempt, came the reply, the forward air controller's professional assessment delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone accustomed to calculating odds of survival in terms of enemy weapon systems and available ammunition. Wraith checked her fuel status and remaining ordnance. She had enough fuel for perhaps 20 more minutes on station, and her weapons inventory included several Hydra rockets along with remaining 13 cannon ammunition. The tactical mathematics were becoming clear. She needed to eliminate the remaining enemy positions quickly and decisively, creating a window of opportunity for helicopter extraction before her fuel reserves forced her to return to base. The morning sun had climbed higher in the Afghan sky, burning off the thin layer of clouds, and providing crystal-clear visibility that worked to her advantage as she prepared for what might be her final attack runs of the engagement. Hammer Base, Wraith-01 requesting immediate medevac launch for Delta Squad extraction. I can provide approximately 15 more minutes of close air support before fuel becomes critical. She transmitted to the command center, knowing that General Harrison and his staff were monitoring every aspect of the engagement and calculating their own risk assessments based on her situation reports. Wraith, Hammer Base copies. Dustoff 7-7 is spinning up now, but they're going to need those southern ridge positions completely eliminated before they can attempt extraction. How copy? Came Harrison's reply, the general's voice carrying the weight of command decisions that balanced acceptable risk against mission requirements. The medevac helicopter crew would be among the most experienced and skilled aviators in theater, but even they couldn't perform miracles against the concentrated firepower that remained positioned on the high ground around the valley. She needed to create a window of opportunity, a brief period when enemy fire was suppressed or eliminated enough to allow the vulnerable helicopter to reach the landing zone and extract the wounded Marines. Wraith selected her remaining Hydra rockets, area effect weapons that would be ideal for suppressing enemy positions scattered across the rocky terrain of the southern ridgeline. Unlike the precision of her cannon or the devastating focused impact of the Maverick missile, the rockets would blanket the target area with multiple warheads, making survival difficult for anyone caught in their coverage zone. Overwatch, I'm going to put rockets into the southern positions. Mark your farthest north position with strobes and keep everyone buttoned up, she transmitted while maneuvering the A-10 for an attack run that would bring her directly into the engagement envelope of any remaining enemy air defense systems. The Taliban fighters had demonstrated their tactical competence throughout the engagement, and she had to assume they were preparing for her next attack with whatever weapon systems they had available. The fact that they'd managed to achieve a missile lock during her previous pass indicated they possessed more sophisticated equipment than the usual array of small arms and rocket-propelled grenades that characterized most insurgent forces. Wraith, Overwatch copies. All friendlies are marked and under hard cover. You are cleared hot on the southern ridge positions, came the forward air controller's acknowledgement, his transmission carrying an undertone of finality that suggested they all understood this might be their last opportunity for successful extraction. The A-10 descended into the valley once again, its pilot and machine working in perfect harmony as weapon systems aligned and firing solutions computed automatically. Through her helmet-mounted sight, Wraith could see the heat signatures of enemy fighters positioned among the rocks, some moving between positions while others remained stationary in prepared defensive positions that had been carefully selected for their fields of fire and available cover. The range closed rapidly as she committed to the attack run, knowing that in the next 30 seconds she would either eliminate the remaining enemy positions or be shot down trying. There was no middle ground in close air support combat, mission success or catastrophic failure, with the lives of 18 Marines hanging in the balance. The first Hydra rocket left its launch tube with a sharp crack and a bright flash, followed in rapid succession by 6 more 2.75-inch rockets that streaked toward the southern ridgeline like avenging angels. Each rocket carried a 17-pound warhead designed to fragment upon impact, sending thousands of steel shards across a wide area that would neutralize personnel and light equipment within its lethal radius. Wraith watched the rockets impact across the target area in a precisely timed sequence, the explosions walking across the ridgeline in a devastating pattern that transformed the enemy positions into a hellscape of smoke, flame, and flying debris. Secondary explosions indicated that at least one rocket had found an ammunition cache, multiplying the destructive effect and eliminating an entire section of the defensive line. Wraith, outstanding shooting. Southern Ridge is quiet. I don't see any movement up there, Overwatch transmitted, his voice carrying the relief of someone who just watched the scales of battle tip decisively in their favor. But Wraith wasn't ready to declare victory yet. The Taliban fighters had demonstrated throughout the engagement that they were adaptable and resilient, capable of repositioning and continuing the fight even after taking heavy casualties. She maintained her altitude and continued to scan the ridgelines with her targeting system, looking for any signs of surviving enemy positions that might threaten the incoming medevac helicopter. Hammer Base, Wraith-01. Southern positions appear neutralized. Recommend Dustoff 77 begin approach from the northeast to minimize exposure time. She transmitted while beginning a wide orbit that would keep her aircraft positioned between the most likely enemy locations and the helicopter's approach route. Wraith, Hammer Base copies. Dustoff 77 is airborne and will be on station in 12 minutes. Continue overwatch and report any signs of enemy activity, General Harrison replied, his voice carrying a note of cautious optimism that suggested he was beginning to believe they might actually succeed in extracting Delta Squad without additional casualties. The morning sky was now brilliant with sunlight. The harsh Afghan landscape spread below in sharp relief as the shadows shortened, and the temperature began to climb toward the punishing heat that characterized this region during the day. But for now, the valley was quiet except for the sound of her twin engines and the occasional radio transmission from the Marines on the ground as they prepared their wounded for extraction. Through her canopy, Wraith could see smoke rising from multiple positions along the ridgelines where her attacks had found their targets. The Taliban fighters who had established such a perfect ambush just hours earlier were now either dead, wounded, or scattered among the rocks with their weapons and communications disrupted by the systematic destruction she'd brought down upon their positions. Overwatch, this is Wraith. I'm showing clear thermal signatures on all ridgelines. Recommend you begin consolidating casualties at the landing zone, she transmitted, knowing that every minute saved in the extraction process would reduce the risk to the helicopter crew and increase the chances of survival for the most critically wounded Marines. The tide of battle had turned, but she remained vigilant, understanding that in counterinsurgency warfare, the enemy's greatest advantage was often their ability to strike when least expected. The A-60 Black Hawk helicopter appeared as a distant speck against the mountainous horizon, growing larger as it approached the valley at maximum speed. Dustoff 77 was flown by Chief Warrant Officer Rebecca Santos and co-piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Michael Thompson, a crew team with over 3,000 hours of combat flight time between them and a reputation for extracting wounded soldiers from impossible situations. Dustoff 77, Wraith-01 has you in sight from the northwest. Valley appears secure, but maintain approach speed and be prepared for immediate departure, Wraith transmitted, positioning her A-10 to provide overwatch during the critical extraction phase when the helicopter would be most vulnerable to enemy fire. The Black Hawk descended rapidly toward the valley floor, its crew scanning for any signs of enemy activity while simultaneously coordinating with the Marines on the ground to ensure a smooth transfer of casualties. The helicopter's door gunners manned their weapons, ready to provide suppressive fire if any Taliban fighters had survived the devastating attacks on their positions. Wraith, Dustoff 77, we're beginning our approach. Thanks for cleaning house up there. This would have been impossible without your work, Santos transmitted, her voice carrying the professional respect that medevac crews held for the close air support pilots who made their dangerous missions possible. Wraith continued her orbit, her eyes constantly scanning the ridgelines for any movement that might indicate surviving enemy fighters preparing to engage the vulnerable helicopter. The A-10's sensors showed clear thermal signatures across all previously identified enemy positions, but she knew that determined fighters could remain hidden among the rocks and emerge at the worst possible moment. On the valley floor, she could see the Marines of Delta Squad moving toward the designated landing zone, carrying their wounded comrades while maintaining defensive positions around the perimeter. Even in their desperate situation, they moved with the tactical discipline that had kept them alive through the long night of combat, understanding that survival often depended on maintaining security protocols even during extraction operations. The Black Hawk flared for landing, its rotor wash sending clouds of dust and debris across the landing zone, as Chief Warrant Officer Santos demonstrated the precision flying that had earned her crew their reputation. Within seconds of touchdown, Marine medics were loading the most critically wounded casualties into the helicopter's cabin, while the crew chief coordinated the complex choreography of a combat medevac under potential enemy fire. Dustoff 77 is on the ground, loading casualties now, came the transmission from the helicopter, followed by updates on the number of patients being loaded and their medical status. Each wounded Marine represented a life that hung in the balance, their survival depending on the speed and skill of the medevac crew and the quality of trauma care available at the field hospital back at the main base. Wraith maintained her protective orbit, her weapons systems armed and ready to engage any enemy positions that might threaten the extraction. The next few minutes would determine whether the morning's combat operations ended in success or tragedy, with no middle ground between complete mission success and catastrophic failure. Wraith 01, movement on the eastern ridge, approximately 500 meters north of your previous target area, came the urgent transmission from the airborne early warning aircraft, its crew detecting heat signatures that Wraith's lower altitude sensors had missed among the rocky terrain and residual heat from previous explosions. She immediately banked toward the reported contact area, her targeting system scanning the eastern ridgeline for any signs of enemy fighters who might have escaped her previous attacks. The thermal imaging revealed two distinct heat signatures moving between positions, clearly human forms that were positioning themselves with what appeared to be a crew-served weapon. Dustoff, you need to expedite that extraction. We've got survivors on the eastern ridge, and they're moving to engage your position, Wraith transmitted while maneuvering for an immediate attack on the newly identified threat. The situation had suddenly become critical. The helicopter was on the ground with wounded Marines aboard, making it an ideal target for enemy fire, while the newly revealed Taliban fighters were positioning themselves with what her targeting system suggested might be a recoilless rifle or rocket-propelled grenade launcher, weapons capable of destroying the Black Hawk with a single well-aimed shot. Guns, 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 she transmitted as she opened fire with the 30 cannon, sending a stream of depleted uranium rounds toward the enemy position. The rounds impacted among the rocks in a tight pattern, the precision of her gunnery honed by years of training and combat experience. One of the heat signatures disappeared immediately, but the second continued moving, suggesting that at least one enemy fighter had survived her attack and was still attempting to engage the helicopter. She adjusted her aim and fired again, the cannon's distinctive sound echoing off the valley walls as another burst of rounds searched among the rocky terrain for the remaining threat. Dustoff 77, we're taking small arms fire from the east, came Santos's urgent transmission, the helicopter crew suddenly under direct attack while loaded with wounded Marines who couldn't defend themselves. The door gunners returned fire with their mounted machine guns, their tracers arcing toward the enemy position, while Chief Warrant Officer Santos prepared for an emergency takeoff that would get her aircraft and its precious cargo out of the engagement zone. But with wounded Marines still being loaded, every second on the ground increased the risk of catastrophic casualties. Wraith rolled into a steep dive toward the eastern ridge, accepting the increased risk from ground fire in exchange for the precision needed to eliminate the remaining enemy threat. Through her targeting system, she could see muzzle flashes from the surviving Taliban fighter's position, his rounds impacting near the helicopter while her